He vanished overnight, no press, no goodbyes, no clue where he went. Keanu Reeves, Hollywood's most beloved actor, packed up half his life and disappeared into silence. But why would a man with everything walk away from the world without telling a soul? What he left behind and what he found will leave you speechless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The first truck arrived just after sunrise. No company name on the side. No flashing hazard lights or uniformed movers shouting across the driveway. Just a quiet engine hum, a cautious turn of wheels over gravel, and the soft click of the transmission being set to park in front of a house that had remained mostly untouched for years. Keanu Reeves' Topanga Canyon residence had always been understated, secluded behind tall trees, hugged by quiet hills, and protected by more silence than security. But that morning, something was different. By 7 a.m., 2 more unmarked trucks joined the first. Their drivers spoke to no one. They moved like shadows, stepping lightly, carrying boxes with a calm precision that suggested experience, not urgency. It wasn't long before neighbors began to notice. Joan Mitchell, who lived 2 doors down, stepped outside with her dog and did a double take. For years, the only change she ever saw was the occasional delivery van or landscaper. But this was a full-scale exit. Furniture, artwork, boxes stacked with what looked like books. A piano was wheeled carefully down the front path by 2 men in plain gray shirts who didn't speak a word. Not to each other, not to her. There were no paparazzi, no helicopters, no assistant pacing the driveway. Keanu wasn't spotted directing the movers or saying goodbye to the house. It was as if he had simply opened the door, pointed once, and walked away from it all. The stillness made everything feel even more unsettling. For a man who had spent decades under the microscope of fame, who couldn't grab a coffee without someone snapping a photo, this level of secrecy felt deliberate. By noon, half the house was empty. A neighbor walking her child to preschool noticed the front door ajar and 2 workers removing a mirror wrapped in linen cloth. She whispered to a friend later that day, "It felt like a ghost was moving out. No sound, no presence, just absence." Others began to whisper too. Had he sold the property? Was he moving to another country? Theories spun like wildfire, filling in the blanks left behind by silence. There hadn't been a single post on Keanu's social media for weeks. Not that he was ever particularly loud online, but even his usual quotes, the occasional photo of his motorcycle or the view from a mountaintop, had stopped. His team hadn't released any statements, no film projects had been publicly announced. He'd missed a recent charity event he was scheduled to attend, and when one of his closest friends, a fellow actor, was asked in a podcast about Keanu's whereabouts, he hesitated and offered a vague reply. "He's just taking some time." The questions piled up quickly. Was he sick? Had he suffered a breakdown? Was this a sabbatical, a spiritual retreat, or something more final? Every possibility carried a different weight. No one wanted to say it, but a few dared to wonder, had something gone terribly wrong? And yet, through all the rumors, one truth was clear. Keanu Reeves was leaving. Quietly, without a trace. But why? The mystery deepened with every passing hour. By the time the sun reached its peak in the sky, the once hidden canyon home had been reduced to its frame. The iconic motorcycle sculpture from his living room was gone. The bookshelves that once held first editions and personal journals were bare. Only faint outlines in the dust hinted that they had ever been there. A single chair remained in the back garden, facing the west hills. No one touched it. People in the neighborhood began to gather in clusters at the end of the block. Quiet murmurs passed between them. One woman said she'd seen him a few days ago at the organic market, just standing near the lemons, lost in thought. Another said she had waved to him during his usual morning walk, and though he nodded in return, he seemed distant, like he was carrying something heavy behind his smile. There had been other signs, now that they looked back. His dog hadn't been seen in the yard for nearly a month. The mail had stopped piling up in the box. The gardener, who used to arrive every Friday like clockwork, hadn't returned for 3 weeks. Small details, things easily overlooked at the time, but now they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Even the staff at the nearby coffee shop, where Keanu was known to quietly sip espresso in the corner, noticed the change. Jess, the barista who often prepared his order without him needing to ask, hadn't seen him in over a month. She kept glancing toward the door every morning, hoping he'd walk in, helmet under one arm, nodding politely. But he never did. Whispers reached the press, but there was nothing to report. No sale records filed, no travel logs, no flights booked under his name. Every source came up empty. A journalist even tried to reach his agent, who responded with a brief email. "Keanu is taking personal time, no further comments." That only made things worse. When Keanu Reeves goes quiet, the world listens harder. Fans flooded online forums, speculating everything from a secret film role to a possible health issue. Some even suggested he had gone off-grid for good, tired of fame and the constant demand for more. "He's done," one post read. "He gave the world enough. Let the man disappear." But for those who knew him, or thought they did, this wasn't just a change of address. This was an unraveling, a deliberate pulling away from everything that had once defined his public life. It wasn't like him to vanish. He was private, yes, but never evasive. Thoughtful, yes, but never aloof. Whatever was happening behind those walls as the final boxes were loaded into the last truck, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary move. By the time the last truck rolled down the narrow canyon road, dusk had begun to settle over the hills. A golden light touched the dry grass and silhouetted the empty house against the horizon. Keanu Reeves had not been seen once during the move. Not at the gate, not through the windows, not in the backyard where he used to read under the trees. His presence was felt only in the absence of noise, in the space he left behind. The air felt different now, like something sacred had been lifted out of the valley. A local boy rode past on his bike and stopped at the gate, peering inside. He'd once met Keanu there, years ago, when his baseball rolled down the hill. Keanu had returned it to him with a quiet smile and a few words of encouragement. That memory lingered now like a photograph fading in the sun. What remained was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from decisions too personal to be explained. There was no farewell party, no goodbye note, just dust where paintings once hung, and shadows cast by windows no longer lit. People talked, of course, they always do, but no one could say for sure where he'd gone. And maybe that was the point, because the man who once walked red carpets and stood in the glow of global attention had chosen to disappear, not into scandal or spectacle, but into stillness, into somewhere no one could follow. Not fans, not paparazzi, not even friends. It wasn't about retreating, it was about release. A neighbor, still standing at the fence, stared at the vacant porch and shook her head. "Something happened," she whispered to herself. "You don't walk away like that unless something deep changes inside." And maybe she was right. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of headlines and flashing cameras, Keanu Reeves was beginning again. Quietly, intentionally, leaving behind a world that demanded so much of him and asking nothing in return. The world waited for answers. They searched property records, followed rumors, built theories out of dust and absence. But the question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Why would Keanu vanish so quietly? And what had he found that made him walk away from everything? The signs had been there. Not loud, not obvious, just enough to be missed if you weren't looking. It started with the invitations. Ones he used to accept without hesitation, charity galas, indie film festivals, quiet dinners with old collaborators. Keanu Reeves had always shown up, never for the cameras, never to steal the spotlight, but because he cared. But suddenly, he wasn't there. He missed the Pacific Film Preservation Dinner, an event he'd quietly attended every year since 2012. No statement, no excuse, just an empty seat. Then came the skipped readings. A table read for a new sci-fi script had been booked months in advance. Keanu had signed on early, excited about the premise, but when the date came, he canceled. Personal reflection was all the email said. Rachel, his longtime assistant, was the first to feel it. She'd worked with him for 12 years, through premieres, heartbreaks, small roles, big ones, and everything in between. Keanu didn't talk much, but he didn't have to. Rachel had learned to read the space around him like weather patterns. And lately, the skies were shifting. At first, she thought he was just exhausted. The industry had a way of draining even the most grounded souls. But then she noticed he wasn't sleeping in the city. The Topanga house stayed dark some nights. His phone would go off for hours. Texts were left unread. He had always been a man of routine. Sunrise rides, late-night calls with directors, quiet script revisions by the fire. But those rhythms were dissolving. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Rachel stopped by the house to drop off contracts. Keanu had said he'd be home, but the place was empty. Not in the usual sense. Not like someone was out running errands. It felt vacant. Still, as if the person who lived there had already emotionally left. He walked inside, careful not to disturb anything. A kettle sat unused on the stove. A mug of tea, half finished, had cooled on the windowsill. And on the kitchen counter, something she'd never seen before, an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages slightly curled. It lay open to a pencil drawing. A small house. The wraparound porch, trees lining the back fence. No notes, no caption, just the image of a home not seen in decades. Rachel recognized it. Keanu had once described that house to her during a late-night conversation in Prague. It was where he lived briefly with his mother as a child, before everything changed. He had said he could still remember the smell of the soil after rain, the rasp of wood under his fingers as he played on the porch. That sketch? It was memory on paper. She didn't touch the journal. She just stood there, staring at the past made visible. And in that moment, she understood. Something was happening. Something big. 2 days later, a call came in from a major studio. A lead role. A script that had already been shaped with Keanu in mind. The director, an old friend, expected him to say yes. It was the kind of project actors waited years for. Complex character, visionary team, a guaranteed festival run. Keanu read it twice, then turned it down. No explanation, just a gentle, private, "Thank you, but I'm going to pass." Rachel had never seen him do that, not without a concrete reason, not without something bigger waiting on the other side. She asked him about it later, gently. He gave her a look she couldn't quite read, kind but unreadable, then said, "I think I need to listen to something else right now." "What do you mean?" she asked. He shrugged. Just quieter voices. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it stayed with her for days. In the weeks that followed, Keanu began disappearing on weekends. He'd leave Friday night and return Sunday evening, sometimes later. He never said where he went. Rachel didn't pry. But the way he came back said more than any words could. He looked weathered. Not tired exactly, just altered. As if the air he was breathing somewhere else was made of different things. He'd walk a little slower, smile a little softer, look out the window longer before responding. And he was carrying books again. Not scripts, not biographies, but poetry, nature journals, collections of letters. Rachel found one left open on his desk. Letters to a young farmer. The margin was filled with pencil marks. A friend from the industry called him to catch up. After 30 minutes of surface-level talk, the friend tried to transition into planning a reunion in LA. Keanu paused, then gently said, "I don't know if I'll be in town." It was an odd thing to say because he was in town. But when the call ended, Keanu placed his phone face down on the table and just stared out the window for nearly an hour. Rachel began to worry, not because he seemed lost, but because he seemed so deeply reflective. There was no sign of crisis, no erratic behavior, no self-destruction. In fact, he seemed more grounded than ever. But it was as if he was preparing for something, quietly sorting through a decision that only he could make. When she asked if he needed help with anything, he smiled and said, "You've already helped more than you know." Then he handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a thank you note and a list of things she no longer needed to do. It read like a goodbye. The online world, as always, noticed the changes before any official announcement came. Fans started posting screenshots of Keanu's social media pages. Quiet, untouched. His last post was nearly a month old. Just a photo of a dirt path in the woods. No caption, no context. The comments underneath ranged from admiration to concern. Is he filming something secret? Is he okay? Anyone else feel like something's off? He's retreating. I hope he's all right. Speculation turned into stories. A tabloid ran an unconfirmed report claiming he'd been spotted at a monastery in Japan. Another suggested he was scouting land in Montana. None of it was confirmed. All of it fed the growing narrative that Keanu Reeves was leaving behind something, and no one knew why. But for those closest to him, it wasn't about where he might be going. It was about where he was, emotionally. He had started speaking differently. Less about career, more about meaning. He'd say things like, "I wonder what stillness really feels like," or, "Maybe I've seen enough of the world. Maybe it's time to feel it instead." Even the way he moved changed. He'd always carried a kind of grace, but now it had softened, slowed. He'd linger outside in the early morning, watching the light creep over the hills. He'd take long walks alone, tracing the trails without his phone, sometimes without even his shoes. One neighbor saw him sitting at the base of a eucalyptus tree for nearly an hour, doing nothing but watching the wind. When asked by an old friend if he was working on a new role, Keanu shook his head and said, "Maybe I'm just working on being me." The film community noticed too. At a press event in Los Angeles, an interviewer casually mentioned Keanu's absence, and a hush fell over the room. One director who had worked with him said, "Sometimes a man like that walks away not because he's tired, but because he's finally awake." Rachel wasn't sure what to believe anymore. All she knew was that something profound was happening. Not to the actor, but to the man. He hadn't explained it to anyone. There were no long confessions, no dramatic speeches, just a growing distance between the life he had lived and the one he was quietly imagining. The sketch on the kitchen counter, the unread scripts, the long drives with no destination, the letter of thanks, the empty calendar. Each moment was a thread, pulling him toward something invisible but deeply real. To the world, it looked like a retreat, a breakdown, maybe even a farewell. But for Keanu Reeves, it was something else entirely. The beginning of a question he had never dared to ask out loud. Who am I without all of this? By the end of the week, every major entertainment blog had picked up on it. Keanu Reeves had disappeared, and nobody could figure out where he'd gone. Paparazzi, used to camping outside his home or tailing his motorcycle through Los Angeles streets, found nothing but empty roads and the occasional frustrated neighbor. No one had seen him. Not on the street. Not at the cafes he once frequented. Not even a blurry photo to spark rumors. Real estate forums lit up with activity. Dozens of amateur sleuths tried tracing his movements by public records, assuming a new property purchase would lead to answers. But there was nothing. No newly filed deeds under his name, no shell companies that could be traced back to him, no activity in the usual celebrity enclaves like Austin, Montecito, or Vancouver. In fact, the last official transaction associated with Keanu Reeves was the sale of a small investment property nearly a year ago. Jason Martin, a real estate analyst who specialized in high net worth clients, was quoted in Variety. "This isn't normal," he said. "Even if he wanted privacy, there's usually a trail, a trust, a business partner, something. But with Keanu, it's like he vanished. No one can even confirm if he's purchased anything new." TMZ flew a drone over Keanu's Topanga property 4 days after the moving trucks departed. The footage showed an eerily empty house. The front doors were open. The garden, once full of wild flowers and herbs, looked undisturbed, as if no one had walked through it in days. The windows were bare. One video clip zoomed into the main living room, revealing only a grand black piano left behind, its bench tucked neatly underneath. Fans online speculated about the piano. Was it left intentionally? A message? Or simply too large to move in time? YouTubers jumped on the story. Titles like, "Where is Keanu Reeves really?" and "Did Keanu leave Hollywood forever?" exploded across timelines. Some were full of speculation, others tried to offer explanations. A few wild theories suggested he had joined a monastery, retreated into the desert, or moved abroad to start a secret foundation, but none of it was based on anything real. It was noise. And Keanu, it seemed, had slipped between the static. Rachel, who had worked beside him for years, was bombarded with requests for comment. She declined every one. "He's not missing," she told one producer off the record. "He's just not where people expect him to be." But not even she knew exactly where he had gone. The online searches widened. Real estate records in Hawaii were combed through. Land deeds in Alaska were cross-referenced with shell companies. His motorcycle club contacts were asked about sightings. A few fans claimed to have spotted him in Oregon. Others swore they saw him at a gas station in Utah. But nothing stuck. He had done the impossible in the digital age. He had disappeared completely and left no trail behind. It wasn't just the public that noticed. Inside the entertainment industry, calls went unanswered. One executive recounted how she'd tried reaching Keanu through his manager for a documentary pitch. The response she got was simple and final. "He's not taking any meetings right now." When she pressed for a timeline, the phone went dead. There was no timeline. A screenwriter who had worked with Keanu years ago posted cryptically on Twitter, "Some men chase meaning. Others just step into it when the rest of us aren't looking." People assumed it referred to him. Blogs published theories. Some suggested he was preparing for a film so intense it required a complete reset. Others believed he was mourning a private loss. But no one could explain how he had erased every digital breadcrumb. The man had spent decades being gracious with fans, polite with journalists, open enough to be beloved. But now, he was gone. Theories grew darker. One claimed Keanu had suffered a medical emergency and was in recovery somewhere. Another claimed he had moved to a secret property in rural Canada near his sister. Others claimed he was building a retreat center for artists and spiritual thinkers. None of it was confirmed. Then came the podcast episode that pushed speculation into overdrive. On a late-night recording, a Hollywood insider, anonymized with a voice modulator, claimed they knew the truth. "He's not coming back," the guest said. "He's done with the whole thing. He bought a place no one would look, somewhere people don't expect people like him to go." The host asked, "What do you mean, like Montana, Wyoming?" "No," the voice said. "Smaller, quieter, like not even on the radar." Within hours, fans started researching every small town within driving distance of Los Angeles. Satellite imagery, travel blogs, obscure property sale notices. Everything was dissected. But even with all that effort, no one could find him. There were no selfies, no signature sightings, No restaurant hosts whispering that Keanu had eaten there. No waitresses snapping blurry photos of his coffee mug. It was as if the planet had swallowed him whole. And yet, the sense that he was still out there hung in the air. Somewhere, beyond the edges of fame, a man who had spent most of his adult life being followed, filmed, and idolized was alone. On purpose. Not lost, not missing, just gone, and for reasons no one could explain. It was a real estate assistant in West Hollywood who said it best. During an anonymous interview, she spoke to a magazine under the condition her name be withheld. "We usually hear things before they happen," she said. "A whisper from a broker, a bid through a holding company. Even when celebs try to be private, there's always something. With Keanu, not a whisper, not a single call. It's like he just unplugged." She paused before adding, "You don't see that anymore. People don't vanish unless they really want to." Another source confirmed that his longtime home in Topanga had been quietly transferred into a charitable trust. No one knew if he still owned it or if he had simply let it go. Either way, it meant something. He wasn't leaving a way back. No breadcrumb trail, no backup plan. Entertainment Tonight ran a segment titled Keanu Reeves, the disappearance that has everyone talking. The host, with genuine concern in her voice, summarized the facts. No public appearances, no known property purchases, no upcoming projects, and absolutely no comment from his team. Viewers were glued to the screen. How could someone so visible become invisible? But for Keanu, that had been the goal all along. The world he left behind was loud, always asking, always pulling. There was never enough time, never enough space. Every word he spoke became a headline, every step he took became a spectacle. And after years of it, something inside him had quietly asked, "What if I stopped?" Not retired, not escaped, just stopped. Listening, moving, being seen. The piano left behind in the living room of his old house now took on deeper meaning. A symbol, maybe, of silence, of final notes, of something he had once cherished, now replaced by something more essential. The music blogger later posted, "Pianos are hard to move, but Keanu could have afforded a team in 5 minutes. He left it on purpose." That was the point. As online speculation continued to spiral, a single thought began to emerge in the quieter corners of conversation. What if he hadn't vanished in fear or sadness? What if he was simply walking towards something better? A life unseen, a life unmeasured, not by awards or roles, but by breath, by sky, by space. The last known image of him, taken months earlier by a fan in a park, showed him staring at the horizon, alone, unbothered. A small half-smile on his face. Looking at that photo now, people began to wonder, had the decision already been made? Had he known, even then, that the trail was ending, and whatever waited ahead would not be found on any map? The place was called Dusty's Diner, a no-frills roadside stop tucked off Highway 89 in northern Arizona. It wasn't listed on Yelp. It had no website, just a hand-painted sign out front, a few cracked picnic tables, and a screen door that creaked like it hadn't been oiled since the 70s. The kind of place people passed through without remembering. Except on that particular morning, someone walked in who would make sure no one there forgot. The woman behind the counter was Kathy Lowry, a local fixture who had been slinging hash browns and pouring coffee in that same spot for 28 years. She could spot a tourist from 50 feet, and she didn't take kindly to folks who acted like they were too good for biscuits and gravy. But that morning, around 9:45 a.m., a man came in wearing a faded hoodie, jeans, and boots dusty from the road. He held a small wooden box under one arm. Kathy didn't think much of him at first. Looked like a traveler, quiet, a little tired. He sat in the far booth by the window. Didn't pull out a phone. didn't look around to see if anyone recognized him. He just sat with the box on the table and stared at it like it held a memory he hadn't unpacked yet. Kathy brought him a menu and asked what he wanted to drink. "Just coffee, black," he said. His voice was soft, a little gravel in it, polite but distant. She brought the coffee and offered the day special, but he barely glanced at the menu. He ordered eggs over medium and sourdough toast. Simple, nothing fancy. It wasn't until she refilled his coffee the second time that she got a better look at the box. It was old, maybe handmade, the kind of thing people used to store letters or jewelry in. Its surface was worn smooth, and a leather strap wrapped around it to keep it closed. One corner was chipped. On top, faintly burned into the wood, was a small engraving, the outline of a house with a single tree beside it. She didn't ask what was inside. He seemed lost in thought, and Kathy had learned not to interrupt men having quiet moments with their ghosts. But then he spoke again. "Excuse me," he said. "Do you know how to get to Sun Hollow Road? It's somewhere west of here, I think." Kathy raised her eyebrows. "Sun Hollow? That's old farmland. Half of it's abandoned now. What are you looking for out there?" He smiled, just barely. "I'm not sure. Just something I might have forgotten." She hesitated, then gave him directions the old-fashioned way. Landmarks, not GPS. He nodded, thanked her, and placed 2 20s on the table, though the bill was barely $9. As he stood, he looked down at the box again, then tucked it under his arm. She watched him walk out the door, the screen slapping shut behind him. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that Kathy realized who he was. She had returned to wiping down the counter, muttering about the jam stuck in the syrup caddy, when a couple came in asking about local cabins. They sat in the same booth he had just vacated. The woman noticed a napkin folded neatly near the window, and underneath it, what looked like a torn photo corner. Kathy picked it up, thinking it was trash, but when she turned it over, she froze. It was a small black and white photograph. Creased, old, the edges curled. It showed a young woman holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 6. They were standing in front of a farmhouse, sunlight pouring over the roof like a memory you could touch. The photo had no names, no dates. But Kathy felt something shift in her chest. She brought the photo behind the counter and stared at it for a long moment before the realization hit. That voice, that stillness, the way he didn't flinch when someone dropped a tray of dishes. It was him, Keanu Reeves. She didn't scream, didn't tell the couple in the booth. She just stood there, hands slightly trembling, heart pounding, like she'd seen a ghost. Because in a way, she had. A living ghost. A man millions adored, but who had looked at her like she was just a person, not a gatekeeper to his past or a fan with a phone. The photo stayed with her. She debated for hours whether to post it, whether to tell someone, but something about the moment felt sacred, like he hadn't meant to leave it, but maybe a part of him had. Later that night, Kathy told her sister what she saw. "He looked like a man holding on to something fragile," she said. "Like whatever was in that box. It wasn't just stuff. It was his anchor." Her sister asked what else she saw. Kathy thought about it. There was a drawing in there too. He opened the box once, just a crack. I only caught a glimpse, but it looked like a child's drawing. Crayon lines, a big sun, a tree, maybe a dog. Could been his kids? Kathy shook her head. "No, I think it was his. Something from when he was little. You could see it in his eyes." She didn't sleep well that night. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Curiosity wrapped in reverence. She'd met a lot of travelers. Some looking for rest. Some running from something. But Keanu Reeves hadn't looked like either. He looked like a man walking toward something, and no one knew what it was. The next morning, Kathy returned to the booth. No one had claimed it since. The napkin was still folded neatly, the photo now locked away in her desk. But something about the space felt different, like it still held a whisper. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down, looking out the window the way he had. She wondered where he was now, whether he'd found Sun Hollow Road, whether whatever he was chasing had greeted him with open arms or silence, and whether the box had been opened under the shade of a tree, releasing a past he wasn't yet ready to share with the world. Meanwhile, the internet still buzzed with rumors. No one online mentioned Arizona. No one guessed a dusty diner with vinyl booths and sticky menus. Kathy kept the secret to herself, not out of fear, but out of respect. He had chosen anonymity, disappearing into the in-between places where no one would think to look. But she kept that photo, not to sell, not to frame, just to remember. Because in that brief moment, she had seen the truth. He wasn't lost. He was remembering, reassembling something broken, threading together the kind of memory that doesn't speak in full sentences, but in fragments. A child's drawing, a mother's smile, the scent of old earth after rain. Whatever was in that box, it wasn't just keepsakes. It was a map, a compass, the last clues to something buried so long ago that it had become legend even to him. Kathy never saw him again. But a few weeks later, an envelope arrived at the diner. No return address. Inside, a single note in delicate, slanted handwriting. "Thank you for the coffee and the directions, Kay?" There was no photograph, no autograph, just that short line. But that was enough. Because in the age of noise, when everyone's life is lived out loud, one man had chosen the quiet road. And somewhere down that path, holding nothing but a wooden box and a memory, Keanu Reeves had found a direction no one else could trace. No headlines, no red carpets, no roles. Just a man, and a question too sacred for cameras, and a journey that, for once, belonged only to him. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a forgotten road in Willow Ridge, a town with one traffic light and no reason to attract outsiders. 80 years old and aging gracefully, the house had seen 4 generations of the same family grow up under its tin roof. But after the last of them moved to Phoenix, it sat empty for nearly 2 years. Locals passed by and shook their heads, wondering if it would ever be lived in again. Then one day, an offer came in. It was quiet, almost suspiciously so, filed through a trust called Northern Horizon Properties with no face attached. The offer wasn't extravagant. In fact, it was modest, just above the asking price. But what caught the attention of the real estate agent, Annie Monroe, was the request for discretion. No signs, no open houses, no media exposure. The buyer wanted to finalize everything within 2 weeks. Annie, who had handled dozens of rural properties over her career, didn't think much of it. Out-of-state buyers were common, people tired of cities looking for quiet places to retire or work remotely. She assumed it was another tech investor from California, maybe someone who wanted to turn the place into a bed and breakfast or rent it out as a writer's retreat. The final inspection was scheduled for Thursday morning. Annie arrived early to unlock the doors, make sure the utilities were functioning, and open the windows to let in some fresh air. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a golden light over the fields beyond the backyard. She stood on the porch for a while, watching a pair of deer nibble at the edge of the orchard. There was something timeless about the land, something peaceful. Even she felt it. At exactly 9:00 a.m., a car pulled up. An old Ford Bronco, dusty from the road. The man who stepped out wore jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a navy blue flannel. No sunglasses, no hat. No one else with him. He walked up the gravel path slowly, his boots crunching the earth. "Good morning," Annie greeted him, trying not to stare. "Morning," he replied, with a warm but quiet voice. It took her a moment to realize who he was. She had seen him in movies, of course. recognized that face from billboards, interviews, and a dozen unforgettable roles. But in person, he didn't feel like a movie star. There was no pretense. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked, cautious. He nodded gently. "Just Keanu, please." She held the door open, still stunned. "Of course. Come on in." The tour was unlike any Annie had ever given. Keanu didn't ask about square footage. He didn't comment on the condition of the flooring or inquire about the insulation. Instead, he stood in each room quietly, as if listening to it breathe. In the kitchen, he touched the worn wooden counter with his fingertips and looked out the window that faced the orchard. "How old are those trees?" he asked. Most of them were planted back in the 60s. The apple and pear trees are still producing. There's a plum tree that flowers in late spring. The soil's been good to them. He nodded and stepped outside, walking toward the edge of the property. Annie followed at a respectful distance. He stopped where the backyard turned into field and closed his eyes for a moment. "What's it like here at sunrise?" he asked softly. She thought for a moment. "Quiet. The sun rises behind those hills, and the light comes in slow. Warms the whole side of the house by 7. Keanu smiled slightly. "That's what I thought." They walked the perimeter slowly. No rush, no agenda. He asked about irrigation, the direction of the wind, whether any part of the roof leaked during monsoon season. His questions weren't technical, they were practical, grounded, the kind a man asks when he plans to stay. When they stepped back inside, he paused by the living room window. "Has it always been this open?" he asked. "Yes. No walls. Just space to breathe." "I like that," he said. "You can feel the day move through here." He didn't speak of renovations. He didn't mention installing anything modern. Instead, he placed his hand on the window frame, then looked at the old brass door handle and said, "It's honest." That was the word he kept coming back to. Honest. The house had no gate, no security cameras, no smart locks or automated lighting. There was no gym, no media room, no temperature-controlled wine cellar. Just creaky floors, sunlit walls, and air that smelled like soil and wood. Back at the kitchen table, Annie laid out the final documents. "You're sure this is the one?" she asked. Keanu sat down, took the pen, and nodded. "Yes, this is exactly what I've been looking for." He signed with a steady hand. No drama, no hesitation, just his name. Then he looked up at her with a kind smile and said, "Thank you for taking care of it." That was all. No handshake selfies, no request for confidentiality agreements, just a quiet gratitude and the sense that this transaction meant more than property. It meant purpose. As Annie packed up her documents, she couldn't help but ask one final question. "What made you choose this place?" she said softly. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked out the window again, toward the trees that were still catching the late morning light. Then he turned back to her. "I used to think home was just wherever you came from," he said. "But maybe it's where you stop running." Annie nodded slowly, letting that settle between them. He stood, lifting a canvas bag from the floor, a modest satchel, nothing more. She noticed that he hadn't brought a team or any furniture, just himself and the intention to be still. He paused at the door and took one last look around the kitchen. "I'll be back next week," he said. "I want to start cleaning the garden beds before spring comes." "You're planning to do that yourself?" Annie asked, surprised. He gave her a quiet smile. "That's the whole point." Then he walked out the door, the screen creaking behind him, and disappeared down the gravel path toward the Bronco. As the engine rumbled to life and pulled away, Annie stood on the porch for a long time. Later that day, she returned to the office and updated the listing status to sold. The buyer's identity was listed only as Northern Horizon Properties, as requested. But the file on her desk meant more than any of the luxury properties she'd sold in the past 5 years. It was proof that someone still cared about silence, about sunrise, about soil and honesty, and rooms that hold warmth instead of noise. Word spread slowly in town, No announcements, no articles. Just a whisper. A man had bought the old farm on the West Road. Some said he looked familiar. Others said he was kind. But no one mentioned movies. No one brought up fame. Because in a place where stars don't shine brighter than morning light on dew-soaked fields, Keanu Reeves had chosen to begin again. Not for show. Not for reinvention. But for something rarer. A return to stillness. The farmhouse stood quiet that evening as dusk colored the windows with a soft amber hue. A breeze passed through the orchard, shaking the branches just enough to make them whisper. And inside, though empty for now, the house was no longer abandoned. It had been chosen, with intention, and that made all the difference. The town of Willow Ridge wasn't used to attention. With a population under 3,000 and only one blinking stoplight in the center of Main Street, it thrived in the quiet that most places had long forgotten. People here still waved from porches. They left their doors unlocked. Kids rode bikes in the afternoon without glancing at phones. News spread the old-fashioned way, by word of mouth, passed between checkout counters and front yard fences. So when the old farmhouse at the edge of town sold after nearly 2 years of vacancy, it raised a few eyebrows. But when the man who bought it was spotted at Johnson's Hardware asking about gardening tools, it sent a ripple through the community that still hasn't fully settled. He walked in just after opening hours on a Wednesday, dressed in jeans, a weathered jacket, and a baseball cap that shaded his eyes. There was nothing flashy about him. No entourage, no designer labels. Just a quiet presence, and a voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. "Do you carry hand tillers?" he asked, looking over a display of seed packets. Harold Johnson, who had run the hardware store since inheriting it from his father in the late 90s, took a moment to respond. He knew every face in town, or thought he did, but this one looked familiar. Too familiar. "Yeah," Harold said slowly. "We keep those in aisle 3, wooden handles, long and short, depends on what you're planting." The man nodded with gratitude and headed in that direction. Harold watched him go, still puzzling over the feeling that he knew this customer from somewhere beyond the walls of his store. A few minutes later, the man returned holding a trowel, a set of gloves, and a packet of heirloom tomato seeds. "You planting a garden?" Harold asked, half to make conversation, half to confirm his growing suspicion. "Trying to," the man said with a small smile. "Haven't done it in a while. Figured I'd start with something forgiving." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Tomatoes can be temperamental around here." "That's fair," he said. "But I've been around temperamental things before." Harold chuckled despite himself, rang up the items and watched as the man paid in cash and left a generous tip in the plastic jar marked high school softball. He didn't introduce himself, didn't sign anything, just offered a quiet, "Thanks, Harold," before walking out. That's what made Harold stop in his tracks. He hadn't told him his name. By that afternoon, 3 more people had reported seeing the same man. One said he was in the corner market, holding a basket of lemons, ginger, and honey. Another said he helped an older woman load mulch into her truck at the gas station and waved away her offer of money. And at Evergreen Grocery, the cashier swore he'd looked her in the eye and thanked her by name before walking out. "I thought maybe he was a cousin of mine," said the cashier, 20-year-old Lena Morris, later that day. "You know how sometimes people just feel familiar, but then I realized that was him. That was Keanu Reeves." The revelation spread fast, faster than news of school closings or football scores, and in a town like Willow Ridge, that meant everyone knew within 24 hours. Still, there were doubters. "You're telling me Keanu Reeves bought the Simmons property?" asked Betty Green, who ran the diner just past the post office. "Come on, what would a man like that be doing here? We don't even have a Starbucks." But then she saw him herself, sitting at the corner booth 2 days later, sipping coffee and reading a Bourne paperback. No sunglasses, no hat, no bodyguard pacing the sidewalk. He looked up and smiled when she brought him a refill. "Thank you," he said. And that was it. Not a celebrity greeting, not a forced smile. Just, "Thank you." After he left, Betty stood still for a long moment, the coffee pot warming her hand. Then she turned to her waitress and said, "Okay, I believe you now." Some in town thought he might be scouting locations for a movie. Others whispered that maybe he was recovering from something: illness, heartbreak, burnout. A few joked he was hiding from aliens or just fed up with Hollywood. But the truth was simpler, and therefore harder to understand. He didn't act like a movie star. He bought peanut butter on sale. He opened doors for people. He complimented a local kid's homemade skateboard. He paid cash, and he never once brought up who he was. There was no press, no paparazzi, no signs that this was a publicity stunt or temporary escape. He wasn't renting. He wasn't passing through. He was settling. The mystery only deepened when people realized how easily he blended in. He wasn't just being polite. He was being present. He remembered names. He asked about people's gardens. He returned the shopping cart. He tipped generously without fanfare. And most of all, he listened. Really listened. Like he wasn't waiting for the conversation to end, but for it to mean something. On a slow Saturday morning, Pastor Thomas Wells, who had served Willow Ridge's only church for 22 years, spotted the man browsing the used books at the weekly market beside Town Hall. He didn't introduce himself at first, just watched from a distance as the man flipped through a copy of Wendell Berry's essays and then picked up an old gardening almanac from the 970 S's. After a few minutes, Pastor Wells walked over and struck up a conversation. "Looking for anything in particular?" The man looked up. "Just learning the land. That book's got some wisdom in it," Wells said. "More weathered than wrong." The man smiled. "That's usually the good kind." They talked for 5 minutes about rain patterns, compost, and the stubbornness of okra in dry soil. Not once did the man mention who he was, and not once did Pastor Wells push. Later, the pastor told his wife, "You can tell when someone's carrying too much noise inside. But this one? He's quiet in the right places." That same weekend, 3 teenagers posted a video on social media. They'd passed the farmhouse while skateboarding and caught a short clip of the man unloading tomato cages from the back of a truck. The video was shaky, taken from a distance, but clear enough to confirm what most of the town already knew. It was Keanu Reeves. The clip went viral by Monday morning, but by then, something interesting had happened. The town closed ranks. Locals who had once been excited now grew protective. The bookstore owner, Marge Jensen, removed the celebrity sighting sign someone taped to her window. The diner refused interviews. The high school principal turned down a news segment request. "He's not a tourist attraction," Marge said to a blogger who showed up with a camera. "He's our neighbor." Even Harold from the hardware store, who once joked about framing the receipt, refused to name the day Keanu came in. "He's just trying to be," Harold said. "Let the man be." That sense of quiet respect became the town's unspoken agreement. Whispers remained, sure, but they were soft now, carried by people who understood that when someone chooses your little town as the place to breathe again, you don't give them reasons to regret it. Keanu Reeves had not asked for space. He had earned it by showing up, by remembering names, by asking about weather instead of the market, and by planting, not performing. In Willow Ridge, he wasn't a mystery to be solved. He was a man who had arrived not to hide, not to escape, but to start something real. The farmhouse creaked softly in the morning wind. Light spilled in through the lace curtains Keanu had left untouched since move-in. They reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite say what. The kitchen still smelled faintly of wood and rain. A kettle steamed quietly on the stove, and his boots sat by the back door, still dusted with last night's work in the garden. In the center of the living room stood a small mantel above the stone fireplace. It wasn't large or polished, just old cedar wood with a slight warp in the middle, worn smooth by time. Keanu had walked past it a dozen times since moving in. Today, he stopped. He reached into a cardboard box near the bookshelf, one of the last he hadn't unpacked. No labels, just a single strip of masking tape on the top. He knew exactly what was inside. Carefully, he opened the flaps and pulled out a small frame wrapped in flannel. It was heavier than it looked. He sat on the edge of the armchair and gently removed the cloth. Inside was the photo, a black and white portrait, simple and timeless, his mother, Patricia, taken sometime in the late 70s. Her hair loose around her shoulders, a half smile tugging at her lips, the corners of her eyes already touched with wisdom. She was standing beside a wooden fence, one hand resting on the post, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. Behind her was nothing but fields and sky. He'd kept this picture for years, moved it from apartment to trailer, from hotels to film sets, but he'd never given it a permanent place, until now. He rose slowly, walked to the mantel, and placed the frame in the center. Then he stepped back and sat on the couch across from it. For a long while, he just stared. The room was silent, save for the ticking of an old clock on the shelf and the faint rustle of wind through the orchard beyond the window. And in that silence, her voice returned. He remembered her voice, not just the sound, but the tone, the rhythm of her sentences. She used to tell stories at night when the lights were low and the television was off, back when they lived in a rented cottage on the outskirts of Toronto. It was small, barely insulated, but it had a yard and an old pear tree. They didn't have much, but his mother made it feel like enough. She'd talk about her childhood in England, about long fields and narrow lanes, and a garden her grandmother used to tend. A good life, she'd say, isn't built in cities. It's planted in quiet soil. He had forgotten that line for years. But now, standing in this quiet farmhouse, the words floated back like a whisper in the rafters. She used to say that when things got hard, when they had to move again, when the bills piled up, when the heat went out and they had to sleep in sweaters. She'd boil water on the stove and make tea and sit with him under a shared blanket and say, "A good life isn't built in cities." Keanu closed his eyes. He could still smell her perfume, lavender and something softer. He could see the way she moved through a room, never rushed, always steady. She had worked hard, too hard. She'd taken jobs others didn't want, seamstress, waitress, dog walker. She did it all, with grace, so her children wouldn't have to carry the same burdens. She never asked for much, but she always believed in beauty. Not the glamorous kind, the simple kind, a well-washed dish, a breeze through open windows, a kind word at the right moment. That was the world she had raised him in, and somewhere along the way he had lost touch with it. Fame had come gradually, then all at once. Roles, awards, expectations. He had done his best to stay grounded, to stay kind, but the noise had become overwhelming. Even when he tried to be invisible, the world found him. Until now. Now, he had found a place where the echoes of her wisdom could rise again. In the orchard, in the silence, in the way the sky changed color without anyone needing to see it. The photo on the mantel seemed to glow in the morning light. And for a moment, Keanu imagined she was right there in the room, nodding, approving, maybe even amused by the choice he'd made. "You finally listened," her eyes seemed to say. "You finally stopped running." He spent the rest of that day tending to the orchard. The trees were older than him, their roots deep and tangled beneath the soil. He didn't prune too much, just enough to help them breathe. Between work, he found himself glancing back toward the house, toward the mantel, toward her. At one point, he caught himself whispering aloud, "This is for you." Not a declaration, not even a prayer, just a statement between a son and a memory. Inside, the house was starting to take shape. It wasn't decorated, that wasn't his style, but the space was becoming lived in. A cast iron pan drying on the counter, books stacked by the window, a hand-drawn garden plan on the fridge, held up by a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Every detail felt intentional, every step quieter, and always that photo on the mantel remained the anchor. It reminded him of who he was before the noise, before the flashing lights, before red carpets and film sets and awards shows, before grief and guilt and loss, before everything became so loud he could no longer hear himself think. That woman in the frame had believed in something he was only beginning to understand. Not success, not recognition, but peace, stillness, the kind of life you couldn't buy or perform into being, the kind you had to grow, season by season, with care and patience and humility. The next morning, he woke early. The sun hadn't risen yet. The sky was still a deep indigo, streaked with the faintest promise of gold. He walked barefoot through the dew, coffee in hand, and stood at the edge of the field. In the silence, he felt her again, not as a ghost, but as a root, as a truth buried deep in the soil beneath his feet. A good life, she'd said, and for the first time in a long while, he believed it was possible. Not someday, here, now. The attic wasn't much more than a crawl space. A narrow wooden ladder led up to it from a hatch in the hallway ceiling, and the air was thick with dust and insulation. Keanu hadn't ventured up there since moving in, but something drew him to it that afternoon. A need to finish unpacking, to clear the last of what he'd carried into this new life. He climbed slowly, careful not to bump his head on the low beams. Sunlight filtered through a small round window at the far end, illuminating the space in a pale golden haze. The attic was mostly empty. A few stray nails in the rafters, an old rocking chair left behind by the previous owners, and a wooden chest that had traveled with him from house to house for over a decade. He had forgotten about the trunk. He knelt beside it, brushing his hand across the lid. The brass latch clicked softly as he opened it. Inside, the contents were wrapped in tissue and time. Old photographs, a film camera, a few childhood drawings, a silk scarf that had once belonged to his mother. He lifted them gently, one by one, each object a portal to another place. At the bottom, beneath a folded linen cloth, was something he didn't expect. A sealed envelope. His name was written on the front in slanted script he recognized instantly. Her handwriting. He paused, the air around him seeming to still. She had written him a letter. Not an email, not a voicemail. A letter. On real paper. With ink that had slightly faded with time. The seal wasn't broken. It was still intact, still untouched. He held it in his hands as if it were made of glass. He sat down on the attic floor, legs crossed, and stared at the envelope. For a long moment, he didn't move, just breathed. Then, gently, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Her words were written in neat rows, the kind of penmanship she used when she was being serious, when something mattered. Keanu read the letter slowly, his eyes moving across the page as if each sentence were a thread holding together the pieces of something fragile. "My dearest," it began, "if you're reading this, I hope it's because you've reached a place in life where you finally have the time to sit in silence. I don't know when that will be. I just hope that one day you'll find a moment like this." She described a trip she had taken in her early 20s, long before he was born, before she ever moved to Canada or met his father. She had gone on a road trip across the American Southwest, driving with a friend who had grown up in a small town in Arizona. One afternoon, they had gotten lost and ended up in a town she hadn't planned to visit, Willow Ridge. She wrote about the red dirt roads, the gentle hills, and the way the people had smiled at her like she belonged. She stayed 2 nights at a local inn, walked the main street, bought a pair of handmade earrings from an old woman with a straw hat, sat on a bench in the park and watched children play without any hurry in the world. There was something about that place, she wrote. It reminded me of who I was before life demanded so much from me. Before I had to pretend. Before survival meant choosing masks over mirrors. She said she had always meant to return. That in her mind it had become more than a memory. It was a symbol. Of peace. Of self. Of stillness. And then came the line that made Keanu pause. If you ever forget who you are, go where no one knows your name, you'll find yourself again. He read that sentence 3 times. She hadn't known he would end up in Willow Ridge. She couldn't have. But somehow the path had circled back to the very town she had once whispered to him about during long talks over tea. The place she called her quiet dream. He looked around the attic, at the dust swirling in the light, at the empty corners filled only with silence. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and closed the trunk. There was nothing left to decide, because the decision had already been made. He descended the attic ladder slowly, the letter still in his hands. Downstairs, the house was quiet, warm from the afternoon sun. The photo of his mother on the mantel seemed to shimmer just slightly as he passed it, as if acknowledging what had just been discovered. He returned to the kitchen and laid the envelope on the table beside a small vase of fresh-picked wildflowers. Then he went outside. The orchard was blooming. The apple trees were beginning to bud. He ran his hand along the bark of the closest one, thinking of the stories she had told him as a child, about a tree that could only bloom when the gardener finally stopped rushing. He hadn't realized then what it meant. He did now. The house wasn't just a new beginning. It was a circle completing itself. That night, Keanu lit a fire in the stone fireplace and sat with a cup of tea in his hands. No television, no phone. Just the crackle of flame and the echo of her voice in his memory. He didn't reread the letter. He didn't need to. Its message had been planted inside him like a seed. He had come to Willow Ridge for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. Some part of him had been pulled here, beyond logic, beyond planning. And now he knew why. She had been here once, and in a way, she had never left. She had passed through this town, touched its silence, and left a trail only he was meant to follow years later. Not to retrace her steps, but to make his own. She had told him how to find himself, and he had listened, not with his ears, but with his life. That night, as the fire dimmed and stars pressed against the farmhouse windows, Keanu felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not relief, not rest, but belonging. He whispered aloud, to no one and everyone, "Thank you." The letter would remain in the trunk, unopened again, not because it had lost meaning, but because it had already served its purpose. Some messages don't need repeating. They just need to be received. The paint peeled in long strips from the white fence that wrapped around the orchard, flaking like paper under the weight of time and sun. Keanu stood with a bucket of fresh white paint and a brush worn from use. There were newer brushes in town, probably better ones, but he liked the feel of this one. It reminded him of being 15 again, helping his mother repaint the windowsills of a rented flat on a Saturday morning. It was the kind of memory that returned without warning, brought back by the scent of old wood and fresh paint. He worked in the early light, before the sun rose too high, shirt sleeves rolled up, jeans dusted with dried clay, a streak of paint across his left wrist. There was no crew, no noise, no planning. Just him, the brush, and the rhythm of the fence coming back to life, stroke by stroke. From the sidewalk across the road, Miss Clara Devine, a third-grade teacher at Willow Ridge Elementary, paused on her morning walk. She carried a tote bag full of graded papers and a thermos of black coffee. She had seen a lot over the years. Students come and go, families move in and out, but nothing quite like this. She stopped, watching for a few moments before calling out gently, "You missed a spot on the corner post." Keanu looked up, then smiled. "Thanks for the tip." She crossed the street and stood by the gate. "You don't see many people painting their own fences these days." "I don't see many fences getting painted at all," he said. dipping the brush again. "You could have hired someone." "I could have," he replied, "but I wanted to do it." Miss Clara studied him for a moment longer. "You planning to stay long?" He glanced at the horizon, then back at the gate. "Long enough to care what it looks like." She smiled, understanding more in that sentence than the words alone. "Well then," she said, "welcome to Willow Ridge." From that moment, the town began to feel different, not just to Keanu, but to the people watching him quietly from behind their routines. A few days later, Keanu stepped into the Willow Ridge Public Library. It was a modest brick building with a cracked parking lot and a roof that leaked during heavy rain. The bell above the door jingled when he entered, drawing the attention of the librarian, Ms. Eleanor Fitz, a woman in her late 60s with glasses that sat low on her nose and a cardigan for every season. She greeted him politely, asked if he needed help, and pointed him toward the nonfiction section when he requested books on soil health and organic gardening. He spent nearly an hour there, sitting in a quiet corner, flipping through books with well-worn pages and pencil marks in the margins. Before leaving, he paused at the donation box by the door. It was small, just a wooden jar with a handwritten sign that read, "Help us fix the roof." Underneath it was a goal marker drawn in red pen, stalled halfway for months. Keanu looked around. No one was watching. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded envelope, and slipped it inside. 2 weeks later, the library roof was repaired. No one knew who had donated the remainder of the funds. The bank confirmed it was a cashier's check, sent through the mail with no return address. Eleanor told the town it must have been a blessing from someone who loved books. Keanu returned to the library the day after repairs were finished. The bell jingled again. This time, Eleanor smiled differently, not like a librarian greeting a visitor, but like someone who had just confirmed a hunch she wasn't going to share. "You're here for more gardening books?" she asked. He nodded. "And maybe something about beekeeping?" "Well," she said, pointing to the shelf, "you're in the right place." He checked out 2 books and left with a soft, "Thank you." No big words, no explanations. Just presence. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Keanu sat on a bench at the edge of the local park with a coffee from Betty's Diner in one hand and nothing urgent on his mind. He had started to enjoy the stillness of small moments, watching leaves move in the breeze, listening to the creak of a swing, observing, not filling space. It was then he noticed a boy sitting alone near the base of a tree, probably 9 or 10, tall for his age, with shaggy dark hair and a hoodie 3 sizes too big. The boy was hunched over something in his lap. Curious, Keanu looked closer and realized it was a notebook. The boy wasn't reading, he was drawing. Not scribbling or doodling, really drawing, detailed sketches of the trees around him, branches, bark patterns, leaf structure. Keanu couldn't help but watch. Not because the drawing was flawless, but because the boy seemed lost in it, completely free. It reminded him of himself, not as an actor, as a child, as a kid who used to sit at the back of class and sketch things because the noise of the world was too loud to talk over. He remembered drawing in the margins of math worksheets, doodling guitars and rivers, escape routes and imaginary animals. When the boy glanced up and noticed him, Keanu offered a small nod. The boy hesitated, then held up his notebook just slightly, an unspoken offer to share. Keanu walked over and sat a few feet away on the edge of the bench. "That's good work," he said gently. "You see things most people don't." The boy shrugged. "It's just trees." Keanu smiled. "Yeah, but not everyone really sees trees." They didn't talk much after that, just sat in the quiet. Eventually, the boy's mother called to him from across the grass, and he packed up his things. Before leaving, he looked back at Keanu and asked, "You live here?" Keanu nodded. "For now." The boy gave a small wave. "You should stay." And then he was gone. That single sentence echoed longer than anything else that day. "You should stay." Keanu turned the words over in his mind as he walked home, through the winding streets of Willow Ridge, past the diner, the market, the hardware store, past the places where he had started to matter, not as a star, but as a man. Each step was another stitch in the quiet life he hadn't planned, but was beginning to embrace. Why here? Because here was where his name didn't come first. Here was where he remembered how to be still. Here was where the past had quietly waited for him to arrive. And maybe, just maybe, here was where the future could finally begin. The rental car crunched up the gravel driveway just after 9 in the morning. A spring breeze rolled through the orchard, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender from the flower beds and the early hum of bees darting between blossoms. Keanu wiped his hands on a towel and stepped down from the porch, his boots leaving fresh imprints in the soft dirt. When the car door opened and Rachel stepped out, he smiled. 12 years of working together hadn't prepared her for this. She stood still for a moment, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, taking in the scene in front of her. A small white farmhouse, window boxes spilling over with wildflowers, a hand-painted wooden bench beneath the old apple tree, a hammock swaying lazily between two trunks, chickens clucking in the background, and Keanu Reeves standing there in a faded t-shirt, jeans, and a ball cap stained with sweat and soil. It didn't look like a retreat. It looked like a home. She walked up the path slowly, unsure of what to say. "I almost didn't recognize you." He chuckled, giving her a light hug. "That's the idea." Rachel stepped back, still stunned. "You look good. Not LA good, actual good." He laughed again, brushing a strand of hair away from his face. "Thanks. You hungry?" He led her inside, where the kitchen smelled of something warm, cinnamon maybe, and citrus. A teapot sat on the stove. A cast-iron pan rested on the counter, beside a plate of fresh scones cooling on a wire rack. The table was simple pine, a single vase of daisies at the center. No marble, no chrome, no designer anything. He poured her tea without asking how she liked it. He already knew. Rachel sat at the table, staring at him as he moved around the kitchen. "You cook now?" "I try," he said. "The garden helps. Been growing herbs, tomatoes, even kale. I still burn toast, though." She smiled, then softened. "You seem different." Keanu glanced up from the teapot and met her gaze. "I am." They spent the afternoon walking the orchard. Keanu showed her the young fig trees he'd planted in early spring, the compost bins he built with reclaimed lumber, and the rainwater collection system he had quietly installed behind the barn. Chickens clucked near the fence line. Bees moved in lazy arcs between budding blossoms. The silence was thick, but not heavy. Rachel walked beside him, arms folded, eyes scanning the horizon. "You've done a lot here." "I've started," he said simply. They reached the edge of the property, where a wooden bench faced the open field. He sat, and she followed. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rachel turned to him. "What made you come here, really?" Keanu took a breath. "I needed to hear myself again." She looked at him, waiting. "For so long, everything felt like I was performing, even when I wasn't on camera. The noise followed me, the expectations, the loss. I could barely think without wondering how it would sound to someone else." He paused, eyes fixed on the hills in the distance. "Look out for me, but here." He looked back at her, a faint smile on his face. "For the first time, I don't feel watched." Rachel's breath caught a little. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Not like a man hiding, like a man found. She brushed a hand over her jeans. "I kept hoping you'd text. I wasn't sure if you were okay. There were rumors?" "I know," he said. "I wasn't trying to scare anyone. I just didn't want to explain something I hadn't figured out yet." She nodded, understanding more than he gave her credit for. "People miss you," she said gently. He looked at her again. "I'm not gone. But the work, the teams, the people, who depended on you. Are you ever coming back?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back against the bench and closed his eyes. The wind moved through the trees behind them. Birds chirped lazily overhead. Then he opened his eyes and said, "To what?" Rachel didn't reply. She didn't need to. The question hung in the air. Not cold, not hostile, just honest, like the rest of this place. "To what?" he had said, and the longer she sat there, the more she realized she didn't have an answer either. Not one that would make him pack a bag or look at this life with any regret. They walked back to the house in silence, the kind of silence only two people who had trusted each other for years could share. She watched him stoop to fix a loose board on the porch, brush sawdust from the step, and open the door like it mattered to him whether it creaked. Inside, he wrapped the leftover scones for her to take. He handed her a cloth napkin like it was instinct, not hospitality. She watched him move through the kitchen like someone who had chosen this life, not fallen into it. As she stepped outside and walked back toward her car, Rachel turned once more. He stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded, one foot resting on the rail. "I don't think I've ever seen you this happy," she said. Keanu smiled. "I'm not happy every second, but I'm whole." She nodded, swallowing against the lump rising in her throat. "I hope you find what you're looking for." "I think I already did." The breeze picked up gently, rustling the trees as she started the engine. He raised a hand in goodbye. She waved back, blinking away tears. As the car pulled away down the gravel road, Rachel looked in the rearview mirror and saw the farmhouse growing smaller, the fields unfolding beside it like pages of a book being read in real time. She realized something then. He hadn't walked away from his old life. He had rewritten it, not with scripts, not with spotlights, but with seeds, silence, and stillness. And for the first time since he vanished, she understood. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something more real than anything fame had ever offered him. The call came on a Monday afternoon. Keanu was kneeling in the garden, thinning rows of carrots with dirt-stained gloves and a straw hat shading his eyes. He had left his phone inside on purpose, a habit that had grown from preference into principle. But that afternoon, when he returned to the kitchen to refill his water, he saw a missed call and a voicemail. The name on the screen stopped him. Michael Devlin, a longtime Hollywood producer he had worked with over a decade ago. A man known for billion-dollar franchises, luxury trailers, and not taking no for an answer. Keanu stared at the screen for a moment, then pressed play. Michael's voice filled the room, energetic and rehearsed like he was still pitching from a boardroom. "Keanu, my man, I've got something you're going to want to hear. No nonsense, just real talk. Lead role, international co-production, huge story, huge budget. You're the only one we want. Shooting in the Alps, some light VFX, and a character arc I know you'll love. I'm flying into Phoenix next week. Let's talk." There was a pause before the voicemail ended. "I know you've gone quiet, but this one's different. Let's make magic again. Call me." Keanu didn't call back. Instead, he deleted the message, placed the phone face down, and stepped back outside, into the air that didn't expect anything of him. 3 days later, a courier arrived at the post office in Willow Ridge, carrying a sealed envelope addressed to Mr. Reeves, private. Inside was a formal letter from Michael's company, outlining the offer. The number was staggering. 7 figures. Front-end and back-end participation. First-class accommodations. Full creative control. And still, Keanu said nothing. He never even opened the script. 2 weeks later, the quiet was broken. It started with a glint on the edge of town. Betty from the diner spotted it first while walking to her car after the breakfast rush. A long lens poking out of a nondescript SUV parked just past the willow trees that lined the county road. The SUV wasn't local. Neither was the man behind the camera, crouched low, snapping photos through the leaves with calculated patience. Word spread fast. It always did in Willow Ridge. The high school janitor mentioned it to the principal, who mentioned it to the librarian, who mentioned it to Harold at the hardware store. By sunset, the entire town knew. They didn't panic. They didn't organize a protest. They didn't confront the man directly. They just acted. The next morning, a note appeared on the corkboard inside Betty's diner, pinned between the flyer for the spring bake sale and a lost dog notice. Written in simple black ink, it read, "Please let him be. He's one of us now." No signature, no decoration, just the truth. A few hours later, someone added a second note beneath it. No interviews, no stories, no flashes. By the end of the day, nearly 24 more had been added. Hell. Bought soil, not silence. Give him both. He's our neighbor, that's enough. Not for sale. Tourists stopped reading them after the first few, but locals didn't. They nodded each time they passed the board. They brought their kids to look. They understood. That weekend, when the SUV showed up again, parked near the general store, Harold walked over with a bag of sunflower seeds in his hand. He knocked on the window. The man behind the camera rolled it down. "Whatever you're hoping to get," Harold said, "you won't find it here." "I'm just doing my job," the man replied. Harold held up the bag. "Then do it somewhere else." The photographer left within the hour. Keanu never addressed the incident. He didn't bring it up at the market or the hardware store. But he noticed the shift. People moved differently around him after that. Gentler, but also firmer. Not in fear, in respect. At the diner, Betty began keeping a corner booth open for him without saying so. If someone asked, she'd simply say it was reserved for a friend. At the library, Miss Fitz tucked aside gardening books and essays on philosophy she thought he might enjoy, placing them on the return cart where she knew he'd see them. At the feed store, when Keanu came in for chicken wire and cracked corn, the clerk gave him a discount and didn't mention the article in the tabloid that had tried and failed to speculate on his whereabouts. No one in town acknowledged the offers coming in. Not the producer's second attempt. Not the entertainment blog that posted a blurry photo of Keanu walking down Main Street with a loaf of sourdough under his arm. Not the national magazine that wrote a piece titled, "Why Keanu Reeves Might Be Hiding in Small-Town America." The people of Willow Ridge didn't read it. Or if they did, they didn't talk about it. They had made a choice. Fame might follow a man, but peace only came when others protected it. That spring, when the garden bloomed with its first wave of marigolds and sweet peas, Keanu stood barefoot on the back porch, sipping coffee, watching the sunrise climb over the hills. There was no camera, no applause, no scripts waiting on the table. Just dew on the grass and birds in the trees. Later that morning, he walked into town and passed the diner. The corkboard was still full. Dozens of new notes had been added over the weeks, some written by children in crayon, some by old-timers with careful penmanship. He paused to read one at the top. "Let him live. He gave us enough." Keanu smiled softly, tucked his hands into his pockets, and kept walking. He didn't need to say thank you. The town already knew. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to disappear into something quieter. And the people of Willow Ridge had given him the rarest thing of all, permission to belong. It started with a broken shovel and a stack of seed catalogs. Keanu had spent the early days of spring tending to the garden patch behind his farmhouse. The soil had been neglected for years, dry and stubborn. But he had time now. Time and a kind of patience that only silence teaches. He worked slowly, often in the early hours before sunrise, when the mist still clung to the trees and the ground was soft from dew. One day, while clearing out the overgrown corner near the back fence, he paused. He stood still for nearly 10 minutes, hands resting on the handle of the shovel, staring at nothing in particular, just listening. The distant sound of a rooster, the slow hum of bees near the porch, the breath of the earth as it warmed. That night, he placed an order for heirloom seeds. tomatoes, squash, lavender, corn. Not for production, not for show. Just the idea of planting something that had survived generations, something that, like him, had come through loss and change and still had more to give. A week later, he started building a small greenhouse by hand. He used reclaimed wood from the local lumber yard. No blueprints, just instinct and quiet labor. The neighbors noticed. One by one, they'd drive by and slow down, watching the progress. Some offered help. Keanu always smiled, always thanked them, but said he preferred to do this part alone. Then, one afternoon, a knock came at his gate. It was Miss Clara, the local elementary school teacher. She stood with a hopeful smile and a clipboard tucked under her arm. "I heard you've got a green thumb now," she said. "We've got a school garden that's more weeds than vegetables. The kids could use a little help. If you're willing." Keanu hesitated for only a second, then nodded. His first visit to the school garden was unannounced. He arrived in jeans and a faded flannel shirt, carrying a small bag of compost and a few seedling trays he'd started in his greenhouse. At first, the children didn't recognize him. He didn't act like someone they'd seen on screen. He crouched beside them in the dirt, showing them how to loosen the soil, how to gently place the roots without crushing them. He asked their names. He remembered them. Every Thursday afternoon after that, Keanu returned. He taught them about composting, how banana peels and eggshells could become food for plants. He explained the beauty of slow growth, of patience, of getting your hands dirty and trusting time to do its work. He answered every question with kindness, even the ones that weren't really about gardening. "Where were you here?" one boy asked, tugging at a glove too big for his hand. Keanu looked at him, the sun warming his face. "To remember who I was," he replied softly, "and to grow something real." By late summer, the school garden was unrecognizable. Rows of bright green leaves, the scent of basil in the air, laughter that echoed through the playground. That was when Miss Clara made the suggestion. "We're hosting the fall festival again," she said, placing a flyer on the bench beside him. "Would you be willing to say a few words? Nothing flashy, just something honest." Keanu looked at the flyer, then at the children. He nodded. "I think I have something I can share." The fall festival came with the first gold leaves of October. Willow Ridge transformed. Handmade booths lined the sidewalks. Jars of jam and cider filled long tables, and children ran with painted faces between hay bales and corn husk displays. Keanu didn't wear a costume. He wore the same flannel, the same boots. When he arrived, no one crowded him, no one asked for photos. He was simply Keanu, the man who helped fix the garden, who knew the names of their children, who carried a box of seeds more often than a script. As dusk fell and the sky turned orange behind the hills, Miss Clara took the stage and quieted the crowd. She spoke briefly about community, about gratitude, and then introduced the man who had quietly become part of their lives. "He's not here as a star," she said. "He's here as a neighbor, and tonight, he's sharing a few words with us." Keanu stepped up with a folded paper in his hand. He paused, looked out over the crowd, families, farmers, teachers, children he had knelt beside in the dirt. Then he began to read. "It's a strange thing," he said, "to be known by millions but feel unknown to yourself. I spent years living in noise, the kind that chases you even when you run. But here, in this small town, in this quiet place, something shifted." He unfolded the page. "It's not a speech, it's a poem. One I wrote here after watching the sunrise through my greenhouse window." He read it slowly, voice steady, eyes never seeking approval. Just connection. Silence is not empty, it is filled. With breath, with memory, with soil turning beneath old roots, with the laughter of children near tomatoes they planted, with names not shouted but spoken gently, with a breeze that forgets fame and a sun that doesn't ask why. I came here to vanish. Instead, I was found. There was no applause at first. just stillness. And then, one by one, people rose to their feet. Not for the actor, not for the celebrity, but for the man who had spoken something true. Keanu stepped down without fanfare. He returned to the crowd, accepted a slice of pumpkin pie from a child with sticky hands, and sat on a hay bale beside the school librarian. He laughed when a goat tried to eat his hat. He stayed until the last booth was packed, until the lanterns were dimmed. That night, walking home under the stars, Keanu looked back only once. The lights of the festival flickered in the distance. He smiled. Something was growing. And for the first time in a long while, it wasn't just inside the greenhouse. It started with a letter. Not an email, not a text message, but a physical letter. Handwritten, sealed, and placed inside Keanu's rural mailbox with no fanfare. The envelope was cream-colored, worn at the edges, and marked only with his name. No return address, no stamp. As if the sender had driven miles just to place it there themselves. Keanu spotted it one morning while walking out to check on the fence posts he'd been repairing. Something about the envelope stopped him. It looked out of time, like it belonged in a drawer with old postcards and sepia-toned photos. He opened it with care. Inside was a single page, folded in half. The handwriting was soft, looping, and unmistakably familiar. Keanu, I wasn't sure if reaching out made sense. It's been too many years, but I heard where you were, from someone who knows someone who knows you. I'll keep it simple. If you're open to it, I'd like to visit, just to say hello, just to sit and talk, like we used to. No expectations, just old ground, new shoes. Mara. The name struck something deep inside him. It felt like hearing a melody he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. Mara. His childhood friend, his partner in mischief and imagination, the girl who once dared him to climb the tallest tree in the park, the one who held his hand at his mother's funeral when he was too numb to cry. They had lost touch before his career took off, before the spotlight consumed his name, before the layers of distance, fame, and silence made contact feel complicated. Keanu stared at the letter for a long time. Then, with a small smile, he walked back to the house, found a smooth river stone from the edge of the orchard, and placed it gently on top of the mailbox. As kids, that had been their signal. A stone meant yes. 2 mornings later, a dusty old Subaru rolled up the gravel road just after sunrise. He saw it through the kitchen window, paused, then stepped outside onto the porch as the engine cut off and the door creaked open. She stood there, jeans and a linen shirt, her hair streaked with gray now, but her posture just as he remembered. Strong, open, fearless in that quiet way. They looked at each other for a moment, no words, just recognition. Then Keanu said softly, "Mara?" She smiled and exhaled. "Hi, stranger." And just like that, the years between them folded away. He opened the gate. She stepped inside, and the visit began, not with big stories or confessions, but with the simple, unmistakable comfort of someone who once knew you before the world did. Keanu led Mara toward the back of the house where the orchard began, his pace unhurried. The early sun glinted off the leaves as they passed through rows of apricot and fig trees, the air carrying a faint, citrusy sweetness. Mara glanced around with a kind of cautious admiration. "This is not what I expected," she said, her eyes scanning the hand-painted signs near the compost bins, the row of seedlings sprouting in reclaimed pots, the worn wooden swing hanging from a walnut branch. "I didn't expect it either," Keanu replied. "At least, not at first." They reached the far end of the orchard where 2 chairs waited under the shade of an old pecan tree. He motioned for her to sit, and she did, tucking her hair behind her ear, the way she used to. "I read your name," he said after a moment, and it felt like a door opened, one I didn't know I'd closed. Mara smiled, her eyes soft. I was nervous sending that letter. I didn't want to intrude, I just needed to know if the person I remembered was still somewhere inside the man I saw on screen. Keanu didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the patch of earth beneath his boots, then back up at her. He's here. Just quieter now. She nodded, holding her cup with both hands as if absorbing his words through the warmth of the tea. I remember when we used to sit like this, under the tree at Sunnyside Park. You had that sketch pad you wouldn't let anyone touch. Still draw, he said, a little surprised to hear himself say it aloud. Not like before. Mostly trees, patterns, nothing meant to be seen. Those were your refuge, she said gently. You used to say that drawing made you feel like you were inside the world, but protected from it at the same time. He nodded again. Still true. They sat for a while without speaking, letting the wind do the talking. Birds chirped nearby. A low breeze rustled through the orchard. Time moved slower here, as if deliberately. Later he gave her a tour of the house, not because it was impressive, but because it was honest. The living room had handmade shelves lined with books. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and cloves. A basket of laundry sat on the floor, unfolded. There was no grand design, no curated aesthetic, just a man making a life. She paused in the hallway, noticing a small framed photo of his mother on a wooden side table. Her eyes lingered. She'd love it here, Mara said. I think she does, Keanu replied. They ended the evening on the porch with bowls of lentil stew he'd made himself, eating in silence, their breaths visible in the cooling night air. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was human, and that was enough. The next morning, the sun stretched slowly across the hills, casting long golden shadows over the orchard. Mara stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, holding a cup of coffee. Keanu was already outside, seated on the edge of the raised garden bed, gently trimming the lavender. She joined him without a word. The silence between them was easy now, shaped by memory and softened by time. Do you ever miss it? She asked eventually, eyes on the horizon. He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. I used to, he said. The buzz, the movement, the applause. Then I realized what I missed wasn't the work. It was who I thought I was, when people still believed in me. Mara turned slightly toward him, brows furrowing. You think people stopped believing? Keanu shook his head. No, I think I stopped listening. She let the words settle before responding. That happens when you live too long in other people's stories. He looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. That's why I came here, to remember mine. Mara nodded, then reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out something wrapped in faded tissue. I brought you this, she said quietly, placing it in his hands. He opened it slowly, revealing a tiny carved wood figure. An old souvenir from a beachside market decades ago. A boy on a bike, his arms outstretched like wings. You gave this to me the summer before you left Toronto, she said. Told me to remember what freedom felt like. Keanu stared at it for a long time. The memory hit him in waves. A dirt trail by the lake. Mara's laughter as she tried to balance no-handed. His own voice calling out, You've got it. I can't believe you kept it, he whispered. It reminded me of a time when nothing had to be perfect to be meaningful. They stood there for a while, two old friends, bound by a thread that time hadn't frayed. Before she left that afternoon, Mara walked slowly back toward her car. He walked with her. Just before she opened the door, she turned to him. I've always wondered, she said, what might have happened if we hadn't drifted. Keanu met her eyes, steady and kind. So have I. No promises, no confessions, just honesty. She leaned in, kissed his cheek gently, then smiled and got in. As the car disappeared down the gravel road, Keanu stayed there in the dust, hand in his pocket, fingers curled tightly around the little wooden boy on the bike. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply waited. and now it was gently finding its way home. The air was still when Keanu stepped out of the farmhouse that morning. The world hadn't yet woken up. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling the trees, no distant trucks on the road. Just a quiet so complete it felt sacred. He was barefoot, the earth still cool from the night. Each step across the dew-soaked grass brought a soft thrill to his senses, reminding him, gently, that he was here, that he was alive. He didn't need an audience. He didn't need a role. All he needed was this morning. He followed the narrow dirt path that wound behind the house, a path he'd cleared himself weeks earlier with nothing but a hand rake and time. He passed the greenhouse, its panes already catching a faint hint of the rising sun. The tomatoes inside were climbing their stakes like they had a mission. The basil was spreading wide. But he didn't pause. Instead, he walked farther, to the far edge of the property where the orchard faded into wild grass and golden weed. There, tucked between a cluster of elderberry and rosemary, sat a patch of newly planted lavender. The soil was dark and turned, the rows still uneven. He hadn't bothered making it perfect. He just wanted it to grow. Keanu knelt beside the lavender patch, fingers brushing the fragile tips of the plants. They were young, unsure, still adjusting to the world around them. But they were rooted. They were real. And that meant everything. He sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly, deliberately. He hadn't told anyone about this spot. Not even Rachel, not Mara. It wasn't for showing, it was for remembering. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It had been read too many times. The edges were worn, the ink slightly smudged from fingers and weather. His mother's handwriting stretched across the page, looping and deliberate. A good life isn't built in cities, it said. It's planted in quiet soil. He didn't read the rest. He didn't need to. He'd memorized every word. For a long time, Keanu just stayed there. No cameras, no scripts, no noise, just breath. The way she used to teach him when life felt too big. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, still, present. This wasn't a scene. There was no dramatic arc, no final act. This was the moment that had redefined everything. Not what he'd left behind, but what he had finally found. A home that didn't depend on walls. A peace that didn't need explanation. And a love that hadn't vanished. It had simply taken root in silence. The sky began to shift above him, hues of indigo and charcoal melting into amber and rose. The sun was still just beneath the hills, but its presence was undeniable. It colored the tips of the lavender, kissed the tops of the orchard trees, and warmed the back of Keanu's neck as he remained crouched near the soil. In that moment, he didn't think about movie sets or red carpets. He didn't hear the voices of agents or fans. Instead, he remembered a different voice. The one that had once sung to him at night, soft and full of hope, when the world had felt too loud for a little boy to sleep. His mother hadn't been perfect, but she had been present, and that had been enough. Keanu slowly reached for the small gardening trowel beside the row of lavender. He began digging a shallow hole beside one of the sprouting stalks. From the pouch he carried at his waist, he pulled out a smooth river stone. It had been in his pocket for days, something he'd picked up during one of his walks near the creek. He didn't know why he'd kept it, only that it felt grounding, weighted, honest. He placed the stone carefully into the earth, then gently covered it. A marker, perhaps, or a promise. Maybe both. The wind stirred then, just slightly, enough to sway the lavender stems in a gentle dance. Keanu looked up, watching them move together, synchronized without effort. He envied that kind of grace. Not the kind you learn in acting school, but the kind you find when you stop trying to prove anything. Behind him, the farmhouse remained quiet. No lights, no movement. It felt like the world had paused for him, giving him permission to just be. He closed his eyes, and in that stillness, something washed over him. Not a revelation, not a vision, just a feeling. Enough. Not in the sense of resignation, but of fullness. For decades he had run, toward roles, away from grief, chasing answers to questions he didn't always understand. But here, with dirt on his hands and the scent of lavender rising to meet the morning air, he finally understood. He wasn't missing, he wasn't lost. He had arrived. The kind of arrival that no one would see. No headlines, no internet buzz, no grand declarations. Just one man on one piece of earth, choosing to breathe instead of perform. And in that breath, there was peace. Keanu stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his palms, but leaving the smudge along his wrist untouched. It felt like a badge of honesty, of work done not for others, but for himself. The sun crested the ridge, bathing the land in gold. Shadows stretched across the orchard. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the faintest sound of distant bells from the town's tiny church. A Sunday morning in Willow Ridge, just like any other. Except this one was his. He walked barefoot along the path back toward the farmhouse, each step pressing into the earth like he was sealing a contract with it. This was no longer temporary. This was no longer escape. This was home. Not in the real estate sense, but in the soul's language. As he reached the porch, he paused again. From where he stood, the view was stunning, not because of sweeping mountains or dramatic valleys, but because of its humility. A gravel road winding past a weathered fence, a few cows far off in the field, a rusty swing set that hadn't worked in years, and the faint outline of Miss Clara's school in the distance. This was not a place people came to be seen. This was a place they came to remember how to live. Inside, the house was quiet. The smell of coffee lingered from the early morning brew. On the mantel, his mother's photograph caught the sunlight, her face glowing just enough to make him smile. He walked over, picked up the photo frame, and looked into her eyes. "I'm still figuring it out," he whispered. "But I think you'd like it here." He didn't need an answer. The warmth in his chest was enough. Setting the photo back down, he grabbed a small notepad from the kitchen counter. It was one of many he kept around now. Pages filled with half-written thoughts, poems he'd never share, ideas that came and went like summer wind. On this one, he wrote, "The moment that matters is the one no one sees." He folded the paper, tucked it into a drawer, and walked back out to the porch. There would be no headlines today, no trending stories, no red carpet arrivals or bolded names, just soil, lavender, memory, and a man who once belonged to the world, now quietly belonging to himself. And that, unseen by cameras or crowds, was the moment that changed everything. By early spring, something had changed in Willow Ridge, not in loud, obvious ways, but in subtle ripples, like the way a stone dropped into a pond disturbs the surface, then gently disappears beneath it. The orchard Keanu had begun to care for was now blooming in full. Apricot trees blushed with early color. The lavender rows had thickened, their scent carrying past the hills. A pair of blue jays had nested near the old greenhouse, and every morning they announced the day before his coffee could. The town, too, had started to shift. A young family from Tucson moved into the yellow cottage on Maple Street, drawn by rumors of peace and slow mornings. Then another couple arrived, school teachers from out of state, eager to trade city stress for quiet growth. By the start of the summer, Willow Ridge's population had risen by 4 families, and for the first time in years, the school no longer feared closure. Miss Clara had tears in her eyes as she announced that enrollment had doubled since fall. The town bookstore, which had shuttered 2 years ago, reopened under a new owner, Mara's niece, Ava, who specialized in used hardcovers and handmade tea blends. It wasn't a profit-making business, but it made enough, and every weekend the front table held a rotating Keanu's Picks section, even though he never once asked for it. And somewhere between those growing things and quiet nods, Keanu began to feel something settle in his bones, a belonging that didn't ask him to perform, to inspire, to lead. It simply welcomed him. He spent his mornings tending the greenhouse, his afternoons helping with town repairs. He learned how to patch fences and seal rooftops. He taught a small group of kids how to paint birdhouses on Sundays. No cameras, no scripts, just wood, nails, and laughter. And then, one evening, as the sky turned to tangerine, Keanu found himself seated across from Pastor Elijah Barnes on a splintered bench behind the tiny white chapel. They had only spoken a handful of times before, usually about seeds or the weather, but that night felt different. Pastor Barnes took a sip of his coffee and asked, "So, you ever miss it? All of it?" Keanu thought about the question. About lights, premieres, makeup trailers, the chaos, the distance. Then he looked around, at the way the light hit the grass, at the faint sound of wind chimes across the field. "I think this was always supposed to be home," he said slowly. "I just didn't know it." The pastor smiled. "Sometimes we have to go far enough away to recognize where we belong." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, exactly that." By the end of that week, Keanu quietly joined the town council meeting, not to speak but to listen. He sat in the back, arms folded, absorbing discussions about playground repairs, winter road maintenance, and what to do with the abandoned lot across from the post office. No one asked him to join, but he kept coming. A month later, the council voted to build a modest community center in that empty lot. It wasn't flashy. No one imagined steel beams or glass facades. Just a simple wood structure with wide porches and space for meetings, potlucks, and maybe a game room for the kids. The town had funds to begin, but not nearly enough to finish. That night, after everyone had gone home, Keanu remained behind with Ava and Miss Clara, reviewing building plans that had been spread across folding tables. Without ceremony, he pulled out a notepad and wrote a number on the corner of the page. "Is this real?" Miss Clara asked, holding back tears. Keanu gave a gentle smile. "Just don't put my name on anything." And they didn't. Not on the fundraising plaque, not in the papers. But word traveled fast in small towns, even when spoken in whispers. Still, no one disturbed his quiet. They simply worked harder, proud to be building something together. They poured cement, raised beams, and sanded every plank by hand. Keanu was there every Saturday, hammer in hand, tool belt on, dirt under his fingernails. And when the final stone was laid, it was he who carried it from the truck bed to the front lawn. An uneven, weathered piece of gray granite, chosen deliberately from a nearby quarry. It was rough, natural, imperfect, just like the land itself. Engraved into it were words no one had expected, yet everyone immediately understood. Grow where no one expects greatness. That's where it thrives. No signature, no credit, just truth. The center opened with little fanfare, as most things in Willow Ridge did. There was pie, folding chairs, a few awkward speeches, and a group of kids from the local school who performed a folk song they'd been rehearsing for weeks. Keanu stood in the back with his arms crossed, smiling softly. Afterward, a little girl walked up and handed him a thank you card shaped like a tree. "Did you build this place?" she asked. Keanu knelt to her height. "Not alone," he said. "It takes a lot of hearts." She giggled and ran off toward the lemonade stand, pigtails bouncing behind her. He stood slowly, watching the scene unfold. Neighbors greeting neighbors, kids chasing bubbles across the grass, music floating from an old speaker. It didn't feel like the end of anything. It felt like something just beginning. As the weeks passed, the community center became more than a building. It became a heartbeat. Locals gathered there after storms to check in on each other, to exchange homegrown vegetables, or simply to sit in quiet company when the world felt heavy. Keanu often arrived early, sweeping the porch or refilling the coffee pot without being asked. He never led, never claimed anything, but somehow, people followed the stillness he brought. One rainy afternoon, Mara joined him by the wide window at the back of the center. Outside, drops rolled down the glass, streaking the reflection of the orchard beyond. "You always this quiet?" she asked, half smiling. He shrugged, arms resting on the windowsill. "Just trying to hear what the world sounds like when it's not shouting." Mara nodded slowly. "It's funny. You didn't come here to lead anything, but you gave this place breath." Keanu didn't answer. He just looked out, watching the soft rain fall over rows of trees, over muddy roads, over the lavender patch now spreading wild across the ridge. Later that evening, as lights blinked on across Willow Ridge and the town tucked into its routines, Keanu sat alone on his porch. No cameras, no speeches, just the soft creak of the rocking chair beneath him. He watched the sky shift from blue to slate, stars breaking through like tiny reminders. He remembered what his mother once said, that a good life was planted in quiet soil. Now he understood, not just with his mind, but with his breath, his bones, his heartbeat. This place wasn't an escape. It was a return to something older than fame, louder than applause, and more sacred than anything he'd known behind velvet ropes. As the wind picked up and a chill swept through the valley, he stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and glanced toward the community center. Its lights were still on. Inside, laughter echoed. He smiled and whispered to the darkness, This is why I stayed." He didn't need a stage anymore. He didn't need the world's eyes on him to feel real. Here, in a town no one expected, surrounded by people who asked for nothing but honesty, he had found something more lasting than legacy. He had found peace, and not the kind built in isolation or retreat, but the kind grown slowly, intentionally, between fence posts and orchard rows, between shared glances and borrowed tools. Willow Ridge hadn't just become his home. It had become his reason. 1 year had passed since the last moving truck rumbled down the dusty road and disappeared into the trees. The seasons had cycled through their rhythms, harvest festivals, first frosts, a spring thunderstorm that washed the valley clean. And now, the early glow of summer returned like a soft promise. Keanu sat on the porch of the farmhouse, the same porch he'd sanded, sealed, and repainted with his own hands. A mug of coffee rested beside him, its warmth rising in lazy curls of steam. At his feet, a golden-furred dog stretched out across the wood, tail thumping lightly each time a bird called in the distance. The animal had wandered onto the property 6 months earlier and never left. Keanu had never named him. Somehow, the dog never needed one. The wind moved gently through the rows of young orchard trees, their branches trembling with early fruit. Beyond the fence, laughter rang out. A child's voice, light and unburdened. Keanu looked up. A young boy from the neighboring farm was playing with a kite, its red tail flickering like fire against the blue. Keanu watched him for a while, a slow smile forming. The boy reminded him of someone, or maybe everyone, that pure energy of becoming. He reached for the notebook beside him. Its pages were filled over the past months with sketches, lists, memories, quiet reflections, scribbled in the dim light of the porch at dawn. Today, though, the page in front of him was blank. Not for long. With the soft scratch of pen on paper, Keanu began to write. "To the boy I used to be." He paused. The wind rustled again, brushing past his face like a familiar hand. He looked out over the field, then back to the page. "You were never lost. You just hadn't arrived yet." The words settled on the paper like dust, final and clean. He didn't write more. He didn't need to. This porch wasn't just a resting place. It was a testament, a quiet one, the kind you don't build to impress anyone, but the kind that holds. He took a sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and leaned back. The house creaked as if answering him. The orchard swayed. In the distance, the faint sound of someone hammering drifted in from the new community center. Keanu closed his eyes. He didn't think about the awards. He didn't think about the cameras. He didn't even think about the roles he never played. He thought about the soil, about roots, about what it meant to truly stay. The porch had become a kind of altar, not for worship, but for stillness. Keanu found himself returning to it every morning, not because it offered anything spectacular, but because it offered nothing at all. No expectations, no noise. Just space. That was the rarest gift of all. He could hear the chickens scratching at the dirt behind the house, the soft cluck of their gossiping lives. A breeze brought in the scent of lavender, the same patch he'd planted beneath the eastern window in memory of his mother. It bloomed now, delicate, fierce, and quiet. She would have smiled. A rusted old mailbox stood at the edge of the gravel path, its red flag never lifted. No one sent him letters here. No bills, no scripts. Just the occasional note from a local child, usually folded in half and marked with misspelled words and a crayon heart. He kept every one of them in a drawer inside, beside a stack of receipts from the hardware store and a single plane ticket he never used. The days were simple, but not small. He'd helped fix fences, sat through a fourth-grade play, caught fireflies. He'd listened to grief and laughed at jokes so bad they circled back to funny. In return, the town gave him something he never knew he'd missed: permission to be ordinary. There were no headlines about Willow Ridge, no celebrity sightings, no flashbulbs or whispered reports, only the quiet unfolding of a life that had nothing to prove. One evening, he sat with Pastor Elijah, a man whose sermons were short but whose silences were long. They shared cornbread and tea on a folding bench outside the church. "I think this was always supposed to be home," Keanu had said, gazing toward the hills. "I just didn't know it." Elijah nodded, letting the words land without reply. That was his way. He didn't fill moments with more than they needed. And when Keanu spoke again, it wasn't as an actor, or even a man reclaiming something lost. It was as someone who had stopped running, not from anything, but toward something better. That night, Keanu walked through the town with no destination. He passed the lit windows of homes he now knew by heart, heard the clink of dishes being washed, the hum of televisions, the uneven rhythm of dogs barking in lazy competition. It was nothing remarkable, but it was everything. As he passed the new community center, he paused at the stone out front. The inscription was short, carved clean into the surface, barely visible unless the light caught it just right. "Grow where no one expects greatness. That's where it thrives." A year had passed since the world stopped asking where he'd gone. A full year of missed red carpets, unanswered interviews, and declined awards. The magazines eventually moved on, the blogs filled their feeds with newer obsessions, and the world, as it always did, forgot. But not here. In Willow Ridge, life didn't revolve around who was trending. It moved with the weather, the seasons, the rhythm of breath and belonging. And on this particular morning, with coffee warming his hands and the soft creak of the porch beneath his feet, Keanu felt no need to be anywhere else. A dog, half retriever, half mystery, lounged beside his chair. She had wandered into his yard months ago, collarless and hungry, and stayed ever since. He'd named her Junie, after a character from one of the bedtime stories his mother used to tell him. She rarely barked, just stayed close. The sound of a child's laughter floated in from across the orchard. The Chen family's daughter, Lucy, was playing with the Thompson boys under the oak tree. Keanu smiled. They didn't look at him like a star. just someone who could be trusted with a swing's push or a jar's lid. He took a deep breath and let the moment stretch. Then, as the light shifted and the wind stirred the branches, he opened a notebook that sat on the table beside him. Inside was a letter, written in neat, measured lines. It was addressed to someone he hadn't spoken to in decades, his younger self. He read it once more, eyes soft. "You were never lost, you just hadn't arrived yet." There was something final in those words, not the end of something, but the settling of it, the grounding. He didn't need to escape or perform or explain anymore. He just needed to live. And here, among these people, on this porch, in this sky-painted place, he finally was. He closed the notebook and sat back, letting the world move around him. Nothing urgent, nothing loud, just the rustle of leaves and the heartbeat of stillness. And maybe that's what we all want. Not fame, not fortune, but the freedom to be unseen and fully known. Have you ever felt called to start over somewhere quiet? Tell us in the comments.